on to evolution, getting into the demand side. So there's a view in the past that was quite popular that basically in human prehistory we were just brutal, brutes, nasty, brutish, maybe short too. And that, this is kind of something that even affects a lot of some evolutionary psychology. For instance, you had some people arguing that the reason why all throughout the world women exhibit a preference for wealthy mates is because in prehistory, having mating with a male with more resources would have been helpful for your children, so you have more surviving children and grandchildren, and that's why today around the world women prefer wealthy mates. This is a logo from a business in Tijuana. I saw driving to the soccer stadium, and I think it kind of sums up this old view of how human prehistory was, just brutish, nasty, violent, people killing each other, men dominating women, etc. Seems like it's not true. Really quick, one experiment had people imagine, men and women imagine that they lived in a prosperous environment, a prosperous country or city or whatever, versus an impoverished environment. As you can see, wealth, the lily lilac color, whatever, it becomes the least important thing in terms of what makes a mate attractive when you imagine yourself in a prosperous environment. So this idea that, the evolutionary psychology argument that women prefer wealthy mates because it's something that was kind of programmed into our genes doesn't seem to be as good of an explanation as we have a massive wealth gap by gender across the world. So it makes sense, given that, to perhaps consider wealth as part of your traits that you find important. Definitely not enough time to go into anywhere near the amount of evidence on what human nature evolved into. But this is just one of the more interesting pieces of evidence I found, that of so many primate species, we're the only ones with white sclera, or whites of the eyes, which tell everyone else who can look at us where we're looking. This sort of thing would be highly unlikely to arise in a species that had mostly competitive interactions with its fellow members. Then people could see which way you're looking, maybe get food before you could get it if everyone was competing. However, if it was a primarily cooperative environment, then it would make sense. Then without having to say anything, without alerting the prey or the predator, you could see where your attention is focused. Just one little bit of evidence, there's tons more. But basically the emerging picture that comes out of this is that our nature is Janus-faced. We have both a highly competitive, selfish psychology that lusts to dominate other people, to be the alpha male, alpha female, represented here by Atlas after shrugging off the weight of the shoulders and all of the world's capital owners giving it up and going on strike, Ayn Rand's nightmare. And over here you've got socialist peasants, rising up and taking power or whatever. But that seems to be the fundamental divide in human psychology produced by our period of speciation. When we became Homo sapiens, the thing that really separated us was our greater ability to cooperate. So we're considered a eusocial species. The only other eusocial species out there are ants, wasps, bees, which also share a higher degree of genetic relatedness between individuals. We cooperate to just the same extent, even more so. In fact, ants are the only other species that engage in war. So, yay us and ants. But the level of cooperation that requires is only present in our species and these other few species. We're a real standout. And it's basically this egalitarian syndrome that evolved that allowed us to reap the benefits and rewards of large-scale cooperation. And this also, one of the more surprising things for me in doing this investigation is, first learning that we have pretty decent evidence that our political ideologies, development of them, are affected by genes, which seems absolutely insane at first look. Like, how could anything in the modern world be affected by a process that took millions of years? But without getting into too much, we have good evidence that we have a kind of left and a right psychology. Left psychology would basically be wanting novelty, wanting change, being bored with the status quo, thinking that there's a different, better way to move into that would be superior to the present. and being anti-hierarchy, while the right psychology would be against change, fearful of the new, comfortable with what exists right now, and accepting of hierarchy. Now, of course, this kind of maps very neatly on to the left-right split in the US. That's where it gets its name, left and right psychology here. But if you apply this to China, you'd have an unexpected result in that left psychology would be, we'd expect people with left psychology to be pro-capitalist democracy. And we'd expect people with right psychology to be Maoists. So it's kind of the opposite there. So just keep in mind, it doesn't always map onto our view of politics. Just put some disgusting images in there because they're fun. But also they, one of the many pieces of evidence showing that we have this ingrained genetic aspect to our political ideology is that you can predict someone's ideology quite effectively just by seeing how they react to disgusting images like this. Right-wingers will react more harshly, strongly to these images. They even have a larger, more developed amygdala, which processes fear and disgust. And that goes into the whole moral foundations theory, the idea that we kind of have a moral palette with 5 or 6 colors, and people on the left prioritize harm or care, avoiding harm, promoting care and fairness, whereas they view authority, in-group loyalty, and purity as somewhat less important, whereas people on the right consider them to be more or less the same. And what this suggests is that this left-right psychological split emerged in evolution because it's an evolutionarily stable strategy, which is basically just a distribution of variance that can't be improved upon. We see this in male-female sex ratios. It's basically 50-50. There's no benefit to be had by having more females or more males being born. 50-50 is the ideal distribution. Likewise, it could be 50-50 left-right psychology works best for human evolution, societal evolution, because of this. The right preserves the status quo. The left fights for reforms, revolution, whatever, novelty. Sometimes it wins and introduces a novelty. Then it goes on to, the right preserves the status quo in time, including the novelty. As Hannah Arendt once said, the day after the revolution, the most ardent revolutionary becomes a conservative. Exactly right. You want to conserve what you won, so if the left wins, eventually the right comes around to protect that innovation. You see that now with so many commentators on the right being big fans of Martin Luther King Jr., whereas 70 years ago they certainly would not have been. And then, of course, you'll have the left sometimes fighting and losing. Then the novelty is rejected, and the right just continues supporting the status quo. So what you have in this ESS is the right basically prevents human social evolution from going too far off the tracks into dangerous territory, destructive territory, and losing all of the things in the past that have been successful and helpful. And the left introduces necessary variance. It introduces variation to make sure that human social evolution doesn't just die from sclerosis. Okay, moving on to the demand side, so social psychological biases. Actually, we already were in the demand side, technically, but this is like a more specific stuff, not just the general left-right split, meaning some of us have an elective affinity to accept right-wing ideas, some of us have an elective affinity to support left-wing ideas. This is more specific about biases that might be politically relevant. So in Michael Gazzaniga's split brain experiments, which are fascinating, you have people whose corpus callosum have been severed for medical reasons, and then given the wonderful opportunity that provides to experiment on them, they're given an instruction that's displayed only to the right side of their brain through their left eye. Something like, get up, please get up and walk somewhere in the room. And then a question is given to just their right eye, which goes to their left side of their brain, which is verbally dominant, and asks them, why did you do that? Why did you just get up and walk? Now you'd expect, if we were the kind of liberal, if we lived up to the liberal ideal of rational individuals that reason through everything fairly well, you would think that they would respond, well, gee, I don't know. I honestly don't know why I got up and walked around the room, because that would be the true answer. They could say, it might have something to do with the fact that you split my brain in half and you're now testing me like a a lab rat, I would guess it has something to do with that, but I really have no idea other than that. But instead, what happens all the time is that they'll come up with some totally fabricated rationalization for why they got up. Like, oh, I went to go get a soda because I was thirsty. It's totally not true. You know exactly why they got up. They were instructed to. But the left side of their brain didn't have access to that information. So it comes up with a justification. And Gazzaniga interprets this as there's an interpreter mechanism in the brain that basically monitors what else is going on in other regions and creates a narrative explanation that makes it seem like we're in control, but really it's just reporting on what else is going on in there. And that kind of is at the basis of all of these psychological biases, that there are a lot of things that are going on in our brain that we're just quite simply not consciously aware of. So we feel like when we're presented with a political issue or a moral judgment, we're like judges. We see arguments on both sides, we listen to the arguments, we decide, very impartially which one is the better argument, we accept that. But all of this research in various forms of bias suggests that instead we're rather skeezy lawyers, like Saul Goodman here, who get presented with a client, basically a moral or political opinion, and then we reason backwards, creating justifications for why we arrived at that gut instinct decision. So I'm just going to go through a couple of biases. There's not that much time to go through all of them, but these are my favorite, I guess you could say. Confirmation bias. So, we tend to basically use different standards of evidence for things that we agree with versus things that challenge what we already agree with. So if we are presented with information that is in accord with our beliefs already, we'll tend to run a confirmatory search. Let me just search and see if this really is true. I'm not going to try to falsify it. I'm just going to try to see if there are people or arguments out there that back this up. Then when we're presented with something that contradicts our beliefs, we do the opposite. We try to falsify it like good Popperian scientists. Let's falsify this negative thing because it makes me feel uncomfortable. And that's basically what's going on here, is that we feel pain. We literally feel psychological pain, anxiety, when we're presented with ideas that go against what we already believe. So to avoid that pain, not consciously, subconsciously, we find it easier to give a very easy sort of judgment to things that we agree with already, and a very harsh, critical, run through with a fine-tooth comb any idea that we find that contradicts what we believe. And this works even among scientists. They did a great experiment where they gave scientists different versions of the paper, and it turns out when the conclusions were other than that which the scientists liked, they became much more harshly critical, but just of the methodology. Nothing else, just the methodology, as if they're really just being fair-minded, but it's a motivated process here. Then another, probably the most pernicious social psychological bias we have is groupishness or in-group bias. There's hundreds of experiments on this. It's an absolutely insane feature of our brains. You give half of a room blue hats and half of a room red hats. You get them to do some collaborative activity. And then at the end, you ask the groups to rate their fellow group members and the out-group members on all sorts of irrelevant criteria. And what they find again and again, no matter how stupid, meaningless, worthless, arbitrary the distinction that was created to create these groups is, that people rate their in-group members as being more intelligent, more attractive, more friendly, more intelligent, more helpful, all of this stuff, from this ridiculous creation of a totally meaningless, arbitrary group. And you can see how this is especially pernicious in the political realm, because we are, our nation, or our religion, or our ideology, or our rebel group, or our, whatever it is, and the others now are in an out-group, and it's quite easy to see us as wonderful, great, and then other people as brutish, evil bastards. I mean, we saw this just recently with all of the uproar over Trump's interview with, what's that guy, Bill O'Reilly, where he said something like, Putin's a killer, and then Trump comes back, he's like, well, you think we're angels too? And, all these people are like, oh my God, how dare you impugn the wonderful United States of which we are a member, and that evil outgroup, Russia. the actual facts would put both groups as backward savages and brutish invaders, but because the U.S. has simply more power, it probably, if you added up the body count, the U.S. would probably win. But this is just an example of how our minds are skewed in favor of our in-group. And I could say the same thing to a Russian group. They would probably do the same thing, but coming at it from the other angle. Particularly pernicious in foreign policy, because then, especially when it comes to war, because then it becomes even easier to demonize the other side and believe that everything that we're doing is right. We don't really need to know about that bunch of evil bastards over there. So it's a particularly dangerous psychological bias for politics. Another one, biases in memory and the overall phenomenon of self-deception. So you guys might have heard that depressed people, on average, actually have more accurate perceptions of how other people perceive them than psychologically healthy people. And that's because psychologically healthy people tend to forget sort of negative memories, bad memories, uncomfortable memories, and preferentially remember memories that put them in a good light. That works just on a simple personal level, but it also works on group level. Our memories about the groups of which we are members are also subject to this. And it's one part of a broader phenomenon of self-deception that there's a lot of evidence for throughout the animal kingdom, but particularly for humans, self-deception, not just deceiving other organisms. So a lot of people, when they hear self-deception the first time, they're like, well, that just seems to be a logical impossibility, right? Like, how can the self deceive itself without letting itself in on the deception, right? But that only makes sense if you view the self as a unitary thing, the unitary self. Once you realize that the brain can have multiple components and one aspect of the mind can be ignorant of what's going on in another area of the mind, then self-deception makes a lot of sense. And it's very evolutionarily advantageous, because you can more easily, more effectively deceive other people if you first deceive yourself. If you realize that you're deceiving someone else, your deception might be less effective. So this example is from a poll of Brits in 2013, asking them their estimates of how many people were killed as a result of the Iraq War. As you can tell, it's rather grotesquely underestimated here. And if you just look at the comparison with the actual scientific estimates, you see the Lancet study estimated over 1 million, PLOS Medicine, 500,000. Even the Iraqi body count, which all it did was just tabulate the media reports of deaths and add those up, as if the media got every single death. But even just that had over 200,000, which is far more than the majority of the public guessed. So, all of these reports had been in the media. They were out in the information ecology. But the question is, how did this information that was available not get into the heads of the people that were asked this polling question? And it can happen in a number of ways. Like, it can happen where you see it, but it immediately, oh God, that makes me feel bad. I supported the war, I just want to ignore it. You can see it and choose to argue against it. You guys who were around at the time might have remembered that when the Lancet study first came out, it inspired many Bush-supporting conservatives to all of a sudden wake up and become armchair amateur philosophers of the science of epidemiology, learning the science overnight and attempting to critique the study design, etc. So you can argue against it, or you can just try to ignore the sources that'll have it. But for whatever reason, the respondents had no, their estimates were just not laughably, but really deplorably low. Then there's the phenomenon of belief persistence, where we can continue to believe in a falsehood even after we've learned that it's false. So in this case, take Spencer Snail, but this is particularly irrelevant when newspapers attempt to issue retractions, for instance, like, oops, we screwed up, let's correct that. That doesn't always work. The reason, I think the best illustration of why this might be the case is in this study where people were given a case study that purported to prove definitively that risk-taking firefighters made the best firefighters. So then, after getting this case study, they were asked to think about why this relationship might be the case. Why is this the case? So they wrote down some reasons as to why this might be the case, So they start writing, oh, they might think on their feet more. No, they don't care about dying, so they save more people. Blah, blah, blah. These are all the possible things that might be the reason why this relationship exists. But then they were told, oops, the case study we gave you was totally fabricated. Total lie. There is no definitive relationship between risk-taking and effectiveness of being a firefighter. So people canceled that out, but they found that nonetheless, they still believed that risk-taking firefighters were better firefighters. And so the explanation for that was, even if you get one of your kind of nodes of your schematic network that govern this subject, even if you eliminate it, you've already developed a much broader schematic structure. You now have all of these other beliefs that don't disappear as soon as that foundational piece of information is discredited. So that's another highly suboptimal design of our psychology. Lastly, as an example, system justification, which is basically like the syndrome, the Stockholm syndrome on an individual political level, whereby it feels painful. It literally gives us anxiety and pain to look out at the political world and say, wow, this is a really unfair, unjust system. That hurts. So people are motivated subconsciously to argue against that, to come up with some sort of justification rationale for how things are, to make it seem as though things are actually quite fair. And there are dozens of, the experiments in this area are just fascinating in the way this works out. But again, very suboptimal from the kind of liberal democratic perspective. You don't want your citizens to be acting like this. You want them, if there's something wrong, you want them to be able to recognize that and attempt to fix the problem.